gather round to hear the good word from the Right Reverend Larken Rose.
I've learned the hard way that a lot of people really cannot grasp satire and sarcasm. So I'm going to start with a disclaimer here. When I was getting ready to do what I'm about to do, I had two main concerns. The first was that I thought some people might be truly offended who really don't need to be, who really shouldn't be. My second concern was that some people wouldn't be offended when they totally should be. We read now from the Gospel according to government, first book of Politicians, chapter 1, verse 1. In the beginning there was chaos and mayhem, and people were as wild beasts, and there was great wailing and gnashing of teeth throughout the land. Then it came to pass that politicians came down out of heaven, shining in glory, and spoke unto the people, saying, We are the Lord thy government, and we have decided to bless you with our presence, so that we may save you from your sins. Obey our commandments, pay tribute unto us, and salvation shall be yours. For without us, you are but stupid, violent animals, and only through our benevolent domination of you shall ye be transformed into a civilized and prosperous people. And the people wondered at the words of the politicians and were sorely afraid. But the politicians said unto them, Fear not. If you will only blindly obey the God-called government and mindlessly comply with our every whim, then you shall be blessed. But any who disobey our commands, the heathens and criminals who think for themselves, being evil in our sight, shall be cast into prison and banished from the collectivist authoritarian paradise we shall create. So cast aside your individual judgment, your free will, your conscience, and your moral codes, and follow us, the high priests of government, without thought or question. The foolish man builds his house upon consensus, cooperation, and voluntary interaction. But the wise man builds his house upon political promises, state coercion, and the lust for power. Free will, self-determination, and peaceful coexistence are the devil's work and lead only to fire and brimstone, suffering and torment. But blind obedience, unthinking loyalty, and unwavering subservience are the path to salvation. You have heard that it hath been said, Love your neighbor and do unto others as you would have done unto you. But we, the politicians, say unto you, Pray for the incarceration or extermination of those who are not like you. But pray also for your neighbors to be taxed and regulated. Pray for your friends to be controlled and enslaved. Devote your heart and soul to the rituals of politics, so that we, the high priests of government, may dominate all of mankind for its own good. Only then shall you have everlasting peace. We are the Lord thy government, and here are our commandments. Thou shalt have no other gods before government. Thou shalt follow no moral codes and no value systems above the arbitrary whims of the politicians. Thou shalt not take the name of government in vain or speak against us, the high priests of state. For those who do are sinners, criminals, and terrorists in our eyes, and shall be wiped from the face of the earth. Remember election day to keep it holy. Judge not the politicians or their mercenaries, lest ye be put on the no-fly list. Honor thy congressman and thy senator, that their reign may be long upon the land which the Lord thy government has taken from thee. Thou shalt murder by voting for those who engage in perpetual warmongering. Thou shalt kill whenever government commands it. And the killing shall be called national defense, serving one's country, and spreading democracy. No greater love hath a man than this, that a man will go halfway around the world to murder complete strangers because we told him to. Thou shalt steal by voting for your neighbors to be taxed, and thou shalt hate and persecute any who resist. Thou shalt covet thy neighbor's income, and his car, and his house, and everything that is thy neighbor's. Thou shalt beg the Lord thy government to take these things from thy neighbor, and give them unto thee. Verily we say unto you, it is greedy and selfish to keep what you have earned, but noble and virtuous to ask us to forcibly take what your neighbor has earned. Thou shalt bear false witness by calling thieves and robbers public servants, by calling usurpers and tyrants leaders and representatives, and by calling those who advocate liberty for all criminals and terrorists. Blessed are the blindly obedient, for the politicians shall reward them. Blessed are they who hunger and thirst after power, for they shall be satisfied. Blessed are the voters, for they shall legitimize tyranny and oppression. Blessed are the bankers, for they shall embezzle the earth. Blessed are the jackbooted thugs, for they shall get away with murder. Blessed are the corrupt in heart, for they shall receive power. Blessed are the warmongers, for they shall imagine themselves to be gods. Blessed are they who have persecuted the innocent for the politicians' sake, for they shall be promoted. And cursed are the heathens and extremists who speak out against our tyranny, who encourage you to question authority, and who instruct you to disobey immoral commands. We, the politicians, say unto you, worship those who insult and exploit you, bow to those who extort and oppress you, and vote for those who despitefully use you and persecute you. Here ends our reading from the first book of Politicians, from the Gospel according to Government. I'm very happy to be able to preach to this congregation because I sense that many of you need help, because I believe you are losing faith in the God called government. Now, at times, our wise and benevolent political masters, they test our faith to make sure we are true believers by doing things which to us may seem insane and immoral. But it is not our place to question. If we are good and pure, we will gladly pay and obey. If we don't like the wars, if we think there's something wrong with them taking our money and giving it to giant banks, or running Ponzi schemes, or fabricating crime, it is a testament to our faith that we will blindly, unthinkingly go along with this oppression to show our loyalty to the state. It is a sin to question the wisdom of our betters, the politicians. I think God has something to say about this. Thanks. The righteous among us will tolerate every indignity and humiliation and insult to show our faith in the state. And only heretics would ever suggest that the politicians that are in Washington are not our rightful lords and masters. Do not listen to such blasphemy. In fact, report it to the authorities whenever you hear it. Ask not what you can do to improve society. Ask how you can empower and enrich the parasitic ruling class so that they can create a totalitarian utopia for all of us. I hope these words will be of value to you. I hope you will apply these lessons to your life. So the next time a cop or a tax collector or a bureaucrat decide to butt into your life or boss you around or rob you or assault you or tase you, I hope you can find the strength to pathetically grovel and submit without question and blindly obey their every whim and cooperate with whatever injustice and hardship they wish to inflict upon you or anyone else, because that is the mark of a virtuous, noble citizen, and that is the path to salvation. Look how well it worked for the Russians and the Germans and the Chinese and the subjects of every other tyrannical regime in history. May we too find peace through warmongering, freedom through subservience, justice through violent aggression, and prosperity through universal enslavement. Here end our lessons. Blessed are those who blindly follow orders and do not think for themselves. Amen. Okay, I'm back. I regained my sanity. Now, what's really sad is what I just delivered is basically the message that we all got, with a few exceptions. We all got from our teachers, from our parents, from the media, and from the government. Now, it wasn't quite that direct or honest, but that is the underlying message, that obedience to the state is a virtue. What's even more sad is government is the religion that people really believe in. Of all the people who label themselves Christian, Jewish, Muslim, atheist, agnostic, whatever, the real religion of the vast majority of people in this country and the world is the worship of government. It's the God they bow to, it's the God they pray for blessings, and it's the God they obey. Where they go on Sunday morning is just window dressing. I want to give a few closing words as this Porkfest winds down. To me, the beauty of Porkfest is not that we're all the same, because we're not. It's not that we all care about the same things, because we don't. It's not that we all agree on everything, because we don't. We just have one thing in common, and that's that we believe in freedom. You know, the media and people out there, they like to talk about diversity. I've never seen any crowd anywhere with the diversity of Porkfest. We have rich and poor and everything in between, and Christians, Jews, Muslims, atheists, agnostics, some religions I haven't even heard of before. Men and women, old and young, all sorts of races. We have gun toters and pacifists, gay and straight, a whole bunch of different personalities, different interests, different priorities, different beliefs. And we do disagree on a lot of things, which is why we like to stand around discussing, even arguing. But we get along. What you don't see here is you don't see us robbing each other. You don't see us assaulting each other or attacking each other or threatening each other. You also don't see cops. Now, you may see a couple and not know it, because apparently they think peaceful coexistence is such a horrible thing that they need to infiltrate it. Other than that, you don't see cops or authority or government, but we get along. So the last thing I want to say is a message not to the people here, but to everyone else on the planet, the rest of the world, knowing that hopefully this will make it to YouTube. Everyone else, you say you want world peace. You say you want freedom and justice and equality and security. You say you want peaceful coexistence. Well, guess what? We have all of that right here at Porkfest. So to the rest of the world, you say you want all those things, and I want you to have all those things. I want the whole world to be Porkfest. And it doesn't mean we all agree. It doesn't mean we see eye to eye on everything. We don't. We already don't, and we never will. That's just fine. We get along. To the rest of the world, if you really want those things, if you really want world peace, justice, freedom, you can have it. But I'll tell you the price. I'll tell you what it's going to cost you if you really want that. Give up the cult of statism and embrace humanity. Thank you.
Warning, this video contains ideas which are not government approved.
Hello, my name is Larken Rose, and like a lot of people these days, I'm fairly strapped for cash, but I think I've come up with a solution. I'm allowed to rob you. Having to earn money is just too inconvenient, so I just gave myself permission to rob you. So I'll be by your house around, let's say, noon tomorrow to see which of your stuff I want to take. Now, this isn't just a threat. I'm not just saying I'm going to rob you. I, by writing this down, gave myself the moral right to rob you. So maybe I should have done it like this. I hereby grant to myself the absolute moral right to steal your stuff. So since I just gave myself the moral right to take your stuff, I'm sure when I show up you'll give me a warm welcome. And in case you think I can't give to myself the right to rob you, some friends of mine helped me out with this one. They signed this one, so it isn't just me now. A lot of people have given me the right to rob you. And in case you weren't impressed with these sort of simple printouts, my friends and I had a very formal meeting and put together this somewhat verbose but very official-looking document. You can read all the details if you really want, but the long and short of it is, now I'm allowed to rob you. So this document makes it all legit. I now have moral permission to rob you, and since I'm sure you're a fine, upstanding citizen, I'm sure you're going to cooperate when I show up tomorrow. So if you could have your valuables all laid out by noon tomorrow so I could see which of your stuff I want to take, that would be good. And then we can... What? Why are you giving me that look? Yeah, surely you don't doubt that this gives me the right to rob you. Surely you're not questioning the legitimacy of this document. Surely you wouldn't still claim that I don't have the right to rob you. I do. See? It says so right there. What, you don't think this is good enough? You don't think that this is binding on you? You don't think that this gives me the right to rob you? Let me show you something. This is a copy of the United States Constitution. And what it says, among other things, is that the Congress shall have power to lay and collect taxes. In other words, a long time ago, a bunch of guys got together and wrote down on a piece of paper, we have the right to rob you. Now, they didn't call it robbery, they called it taxation, because it sounds nicer. But it's essentially the same thing. We have the right to take your property from you by force, if necessary, without your consent. Now, they also wrote a whole lot of rules about how the robbers would be appointed and the legislative rituals which would have to precede the robbery and the different kinds of robbery they'd be allowed to do. But in essence, what this piece of the Constitution says is, we have the right to rob you. And did you believe them? When I did it, when I wrote down on paper that I had the right to rob you, you gave me a funny look. When they did it, did you believe them? Did you accept that this gave them moral permission to take your property without your consent? I bet you did. If you're like 99.999% of the population, you have accepted as unquestionable gospel The notion that this piece of paper gave to some mere mortal human beings the moral right to forcibly confiscate wealth from other people and call it taxation. In fact, if you're like 99.999% of the population, you've never even thought about this until right now. The IRS, it's hundreds of offices across the country, it's 100,000 employees, all the properties they've seized, all the bank accounts they've wiped out, all the people they've prosecuted and thrown in prison, all federal taxes, income, estate, employment, excises, all of them, all federal tax collection stems from this scribble of ink on a piece of parchment. This is supposedly the source of the authority for every bit of that. These few words scrawled on a piece of parchment a couple hundred years ago. By writing this, they claim to bestow upon those people calling themselves Congress a right that you don't have and I don't have. The right to take money by force, if necessary, from other people. And I bet that up till now, you have accepted that as unquestionably legitimate. You accepted the notion that this little bit of ink on a piece of parchment written hundreds of years ago actually gave moral permission for certain people to rob millions of other people. And I bet you look down on any who don't believe it. The people who are called tax cheats because they try to not get robbed, even though this piece of parchment says that somebody is allowed to rob them, I bet you think they're despicable criminals. I bet you cheer when those people have their bank accounts wiped out and their houses seized and get thrown in jail because you really believe that this little bit of ink on a piece of parchment from a couple hundred years ago gave the moral right for some people to steal from other people. Wow, they must have had some powerful magic ink that by writing down on a piece of paper, we have the right to rob you, they actually altered morality. They made stealing into a good thing in certain situations. Now, I'm betting that you immediately realized when I showed you this piece of paper that it was bogus, that it was silly for me to claim that a piece of paper could give me the right to rob you. And it doesn't matter if it was done in magic marker, it doesn't matter if I printed it out, it doesn't matter if I did it myself or had other people sign it. Nothing, no ritual, no document, no legislation that I could do, that any number of people could do, could give to me the right to rob you any more than they could give me the right to murder you. But that's not what you were taught in school. You and most of your friends and most of your neighbors were all taught and all believed that this scribble on a piece of parchment gave the moral right to certain people to rob millions of other people. Well, that belief, as widely held as it is more absurd by several degrees than believing that I could give myself the right to rob you with this piece of paper. For starters, at least my piece of paper claims a source for this alleged right to steal. I have the right to rob you because I said so, or because my friend said so. The Constitution doesn't even do that. It says Congress shall have power to lay and collect taxes. Doesn't say where they got it. Second, my scribble on a piece of paper identifies a living, breathing person to whom this right to steal is supposedly being given. Me. The Constitution claims to grant this power to people who weren't even born when the document was written, who weren't born for 200 years after the document was written. Likewise, while my scribble on a piece of paper identifies a living, breathing victim, you, the Constitution pretends to give the right to rob people who wouldn't be born until 200 years after the Constitution was written. That's like me writing, my great-great-grandchildren shall have the right to rob your great-great-grandchildren. In fact, it's worse than that, because there are no time limits in the Constitution. In short, what this scribble of ink on parchment alleges is that the people calling themselves Congress will, until the end of time, have the moral right to forcibly confiscate wealth from people without their consent. Let me put this as bluntly as I can. If you believe that this piece of paper gave me the moral right to rob you, you're out of your mind. If you believe that this piece of paper gave to Congress the moral right to rob you, you're certainly not alone, but you're still out of your mind. It's time to get back in your mind and start rethinking some of the absolute bunk that you've been taught all your life.
All day, marching bands and that sort of thing, but I'm going to dive right into our first introduction. I'm introducing each one of these speakers with a lot of pride. I'm proud of everyone that's going to be here today. The first person I want to bring up is Larken Rose. Larken Rose, if you don't know him, he's a self-proclaimed enemy of the state. He's a tax heretic, the author of 3 books, and his most latest book, The Iron Web, got great reviews within the freedom movement. And has anybody seen America, Freedom to Fascism? Good. Put together by our late filmmaker Aaron Russo, who also made Trading Places, by the way. Made a movie called Freedom to Fascism, and it features our next speaker, Larken Rose. Give a round of applause to Larken Rose.
Thank you very much. I'm going to say some things today that are going to anger a lot of people and offend a lot of people and probably make lots of people go, yay! But I'm pretty sure you won't be bored. 233 years ago, a bunch of guys got together right over there, and they wrote a letter to their king. And it was a very well thought out, very eloquent letter, but it basically boiled down to this. Dear King George, you're not the boss of us. Sincerely, bunch of troublemakers. Because that's essentially what the Declaration of Independence was. It was not whining to the king, oh, will you please be nice and lower your taxes and do this. In fact, the Declaration specifically describes how they had tried that and it didn't work. Now, for all the parades and celebrations and picnics and fireworks that are going to go on today across this country, all the millions of people engaged in this celebration, how many of them actually think about what the Declaration of Independence was? What those people did? Those people were criminals. They were tax cheats. They were traitors. They looked their government, the British Crown, in the face and said, we do not acknowledge your right to rule us at all. They did not say, will you please reduce this and please be nicer here. They said, it's over. Truth be told, some of the colonists were cop killers. If you don't believe me, what do you think happened at Lexington when King George's law enforcers said, you colonists, lay down your guns? They said, no, you're not the boss of us. And so we had the shot heard round the world, which is widely regarded as the beginning of the American Revolution. How many people celebrating across this country today actually support that kind of radical, extremist action and attitude that you can go to your own government and say, we're not going to obey you anymore. We do not acknowledge your right to rule us at all ever again. Personally, I doubt it's very many Americans. We have lots of sort of residual freedoms left over from what a bunch of radicals did a long time ago, and it's sort of fun to be this close to where some very significant steps in that happened. But the bad news is the spirit that allowed this country is basically dead in the vast majority of Americans. The vast majority of Americans are absolutely incapable of thinking, much less speaking, the concept, "You're not the boss of me." Now, when we look back, it's easy for us to cheer, hooray for the rebels, and we know how it turned out. We know they won. We know the revolution was successful and King George got his butt kicked. So we can say yay, yay, hooray. But make no mistake, when you cheer for the people who had the American Revolution, you are cheering for traitors and criminals. They broke the law. Freedom is always illegal. Let this one thing sink in. If you don't hear anything else, freedom is always illegal because the people who want power over you will always say keeping what you earn is against the law. Being armed is against the law. Determining your own future is against the law. And how many Americans, as much as they celebrate Independence Day, are capable of even thinking those thoughts? Let's do a comparison. Suppose a group in this country today did what the founders did 233 years ago. Suppose they wrote a letter to the United States government, a letter to Congress and the president, and said, "We will not pay your taxes ever again. We will not obey your laws ever again. We do not acknowledge your right to rule us at all ever again. And when you send your thugs to enforce your will on us, we will resist." How many Americans dare to even think that? And what would most Americans think of any group that did that? Horrible criminals and traitors and fringe lunatics, and we can't have that. Well, why do we have this double standard? Why is the whole country having these huge celebrations over Independence Day where a bunch of criminals broke the law, committed treason, and resisted authority, when the vast majority of all those people out there having celebrations would be the first in line to condemn anyone who did that today? Why the double standard? Did morality change sometime in the last 233 years? In short, the spirit of resistance, the ability to say, "You're not the boss of me," is gone from the vast majority of American culture. It has been trained out of us. And for all the pride people express today, I'm here to tell you, the American people are wimps. And why is that? It's not just bad luck. It's not a coincidence. For years and years and years, the churches, the schools, the media, the government, society in general has taught us one rule above all else. Obedience to authority is the highest virtue, and disobedience is the worst sin. That is the message that comes through everything else. And you can see it. Here's where I'm going to offend a lot of people. You can see it in the freedom movement. Because the vast majority of the freedom movement consists of people saying, let's vote for these people, let's push for this legislation, let's lobby for this and that and the other thing. And they couch their demands in, of course, we will only do things within the system. We would never advocate anything illegal. Well, I hate to spoil your party, but the Declaration of Independence was not about doing something within the system. It was about saying, we're free whether authority says so or not, and we will resist. Even if you call it law, even if you call yourself government, even if you wear fancy hats and have big, important meetings, we will resist because we own ourselves. So how many people advocate that now? Patrick Henry, Thomas Paine, where are they in the mainstream? They're not there. There's a few fringe wackos like me and a bunch of people I see here. But these people that get revered all across the country as being these great these great heroes of the American Revolution, the people who cheer for them do not believe what those men believed in. They believed in something called unalienable rights. That means you have a right to do something. If the law says you can't do it, you still have the right to do it. If the government says you can't do it, you still have the right to do it. Unalienable means nothing anyone in the world can do takes away your right to do that. Now they can infringe on that right, which they do on a regular basis. They can stomp on you and they can hurt you and they can punish you, but it will never be legitimate. And nobody should ever bow. Sorry, I hear thunder here. It's fake thunder, don't worry. That nobody should ever bow to someone who says, well, no, we had these elections and these processes and this and that and the other thing. Now I have the right to infringe on this and that and the other thing. Nothing gives them the right. That's what unalienable means. But Americans, by and large, do not believe that. Now, some people, every once in a while, will say, well, it was really oppressive back in 1776, and we're just not quite to that point yet. If 2 to 3% taxation justified a revolution in 1776, why doesn't 50% and growing justify a revolution? If a few little excise taxes on pieces of paper and tea justified open lawlessness from these rebels that we're all celebrating, why don't the myriad of incomprehensible, unavoidable, crushing taxes, state, local, and federal, why don't they justify a revolution today? If the occasional abuse of the colonists by the redcoats justified a revolution back then, why isn't it justified today by the fact that the vast majority of American law enforcement see no problem at all with randomly stopping you, detaining you, interrogating you, and searching you for any reason they like or no reason at all? If you read the Fourth Amendment, you realize, wow, they had a revolution over that. So where's the spirit? With all the flag waving and with all the celebrating, where are the people who actually believe in what happened right over there 233 years ago? What exactly are we proud of if we let that go? People talk about American pride. What is it they're proud of? That reminds me, somebody gave me a note here to read you. The guy's name was Samuel Adams. Yeah, the beer guy, but he did some other stuff too. If ye love wealth better than liberty, the tranquility of servitude better than the animating contest of freedom, go home from us in peace. We ask not your counsels or arms. Crouch down and lick the hands which feed you. May your chains set lightly upon you, and may posterity forget that ye were our countrymen. So what happened? Why did this nation lose its ability to say, you're not the boss of me? Even among people who say we're the most ardent supporters of freedom, if you say, are you willing to break the law? They say, no, I would never do that. In other words, you're ardent advocates of freedom as long as the tyrants give their permission. That's not being advocates of freedom. In Lexington, what happened when the troops said, lay down your guns? Did they say, can't we keep them pretty, please? Okay, here you go. No, they said no. Where are the Americans capable of saying no? I'm not talking about voting and whining to your congressman. I'm talking about resistance. And I know even hearing about this makes a lot of people very uncomfortable, because the American people do not believe what the Founding Fathers believed. The problem is we have been trained for years and years and years to measure our worth based on how well we obey authority, not on how we treat other people,
not on what we produce, on how well we obey authority. Consider the example of the phrase, law-abiding taxpayer. People use that constantly, and what they mean when they say, I'm a law-abiding taxpayer, is, I'm a good person. Okay, but what does law-abiding taxpayer actually mean? Well, the law-abiding means you do what the politicians tell you. Now, as much as we revere the law, and we talk about those nasty lawbreakers and those great law-abiding citizens, and we talk as if the law is some proclamation from on high, we know who writes them. They're a bunch of liars and crooks. Does anybody not know that the politicians are a bunch of liars and crooks? So why is it that when they say you have to do this, you're not allowed to do that, we call it law and we bow to it like it came down from on high? It's the commands of crooks, but we have been trained to view it as the measure of whether we are good people. Let's consider a few examples. Nazi Germany. Nazi Germany had a whole lot of law-abiding taxpayers who went along with the agenda of the Third Reich and who funded it. Were they the good guys? Nope. The good guys in Nazi Germany were the criminals. The people who said, what you're doing is illegal. I will disobey your laws and I will not pay your taxes. Same thing under Stalin, Mao, Pol Pot, Castro, you can go right down the list. It's a really long list. The good people were not the people who were law-abiding taxpayers. The good people were the people who said, I am not going to help those people wearing the label of government to oppress and injure and murder my fellow man. If they call that law, I am proud to be a criminal. And as much as we revere the law, if you need politicians telling you what's right and wrong, something's horribly wrong. Here's a quote from Thomas Jefferson, because I just want to let you know, I'm not the first radical wacko to say these sorts of things. Rightful liberty is unobstructed action according to our will within limits drawn around us by the equal rights of others. I do not add within the limits of the law, because law is often but the tyrant's will, and always so when it violates the rights of the individual. So what about right here? We can look at lots of other times, lots of other places and say, hooray for the people who broke the law. We can look back in this country's history when slavery was legal. Just as evil, but it was legal. Were the good guys the people who went along with it? Nope, the good guys broke the law. And we can see that in this country, in the past, and lots of other countries, present and past. What about this country today? Do we really want to tell ourselves that, well, no, it's not okay to resist now, among other things? When people feel this moral obligation to obey the law, and they speak it as if it's some proclamation from on high, what exactly is your moral obligation? To work really hard so you can give thousands of dollars to Obama so he can give them to international bankers? Where is the moral obligation?
Nowhere.
Where is the moral obligation to fund whatever war any politician happens to say, hey, I bet if I do that, it'll help my image? Why do we believe we have a moral obligation to obey whatever they call law? Here's a radical thought. You have a moral obligation to recognize and honor the rights of every individual on the planet, no matter what the law says. And do we all feel a moral obligation to finance the police state we see growing up all over the place? Trouble is, we've forgotten a very important secret. And the founders, a bunch of them referenced it, but even they didn't seem to fully grasp it. Here it is. I have to say it quietly. It's a secret. You own yourself. Oh, you've heard that secret?
And this country.
You own yourself. Now, when I say that to almost anybody, they say, well, of course I do.
And the country.
Are you sure you think that? Yeah, of course I do. Of course I own myself. So you own your time and effort. Yeah. So what you produce with your time and effort, no one has the right to take that from you by force without your consent, right? Oh, of course not. What if they call it taxes? Oh, that's different. No, it's not. It is not different. If you own yourself, someone calling himself government, someone calling his demands laws and taxes or anything else, it is still theft. And there are some radical wackos in history like Frederick Bastiat who did a great job of explaining that obvious truth, a truth that is completely lost on the vast majority of Americans. And I could go down the list for ages, which I'm not going to do. If you own yourself, would you have to pay rent for the property you already bought? No. What if it's called property taxes? If you own yourself, doesn't that imply, and if you have the right to life, liberty, and property, they changed the last one to happiness because it sounded more poetic. Initially, it was going to be life, liberty, and property, because property is essential to freedom. If I can't make something and own it myself, then what good is my time worth to me if it doesn't belong to me? So back when it was called life, liberty, and property, if you have the right to those things, doesn't that sort of imply you have the right to defend those things against all aggressors? What if the aggressors say, well, we're government and this is law? You know, everybody can see if some thug comes to your house and points a gun at you and says, hand it over because I want it, then it's perfectly okay to defend yourself. But if they call it government and they call it law and they call it taxes, suddenly everyone's perception drastically changes. Suddenly the guy who produced it, who says, wait, I produced this, I want to keep it, he's the evil, nasty, greedy criminal. And the thug pointing a gun at him to say, nope, sorry, goes to the politicians, he's the noble law enforcer. When did our perception of reality get so messed up? Now, I'm going to finish it up here. Hope I riled up enough people already. The concept of freedom and being able to defend your liberty sort of implies you have the right to have the ability to defend your liberty. Now, I have an email list, and a while ago I sent a thing to the list that says, I want every American to have the ability to forcibly resist federal agents. As you may expect, it freaked out some people who work over there. And I suspect it would freak out most of the country. What are you talking about? You want people to have the ability to kill law enforcers? Is that what you're saying? Yep. I'm not saying go out and slaughter them wildly. I'm saying you should have the ability. And 233 years ago, some guys explained why and demonstrated why you should have that ability. But as scared as people are of that concept, what's the alternative? That you should not have the ability to resist your own government. Which of those scares you more? Because I got to tell you, the idea of a people incapable of protecting itself from its own government, that's really scary to me. You have one obligation as human beings, and it goes directly against almost everything you've been taught in school and in society and in the media and everywhere else. Your obligation is to judge right and wrong for yourselves and to act accordingly. And if somebody says, no, I'm the boss, I'm in charge, I'm authority, I lay down the law, you do this, you have the right to say, no, I'm not going to do the wrong thing just because the law tells me to. And when they huff and puff and say, you're nasty criminals and scofflaws and malcontents and horrible people that you would dare to disobey authority, you tell them, you're not the boss of me. Thank you.
If this speech got your attention and you're ready for more ideas you won't hear in the mainstream media, grab grab a copy of Larken Rose's new novel, The Iron Web. The Iron Web is a gripping adventure story that you won't want to put down, but it's also likely to shake up some of your favorite assumptions and longest-held beliefs. Many books entertain people. The Iron Web is the kind of book that changes people. Do you dare to read it?
Mr. Jones owned a cotton plantation and many slaves. One day he was talking to the owner of the plantation next to his, and Mr. Jones was lamenting the fact that times were tough. He was having to work his slaves harder than ever, and was having trouble with some of them being disobedient or trying to run away. The other plantation owner said he knew someone who could help.
Day 1.
One day Mr. Jones called his slaves together so a man named Mr. Smith could talk to them. Before beginning, Mr. Smith whispered to Mr. Jones, "Whatever I say, do not contradict me or interfere, and I promise you your slave troubles will end." "My name is Mr. Smith," he said to the slaves, "and this may be the happiest day of your lives. From today forward, you will no longer be slaves, but free men." Mr. Jones was so shocked he started to step forward, but Mr. Smith gestured for him to remain silent. He did, only because the other plantation owner had spoken so highly of Mr. Smith's skills. "You are no longer the property of Mr. Jones," Mr. Smith continued. "You are free. No more would you be forced to labor for the benefit of Mr. Jones. Now you can work for yourselves." Now the slaves were all murmuring and looking at each other. Many were smiling, many were looking puzzled. "In fact, you are now free to leave the plantation whenever you want," Mr. Smith said. "However, since we are surrounded by other plantations, if you leave, some other plantation owner will likely claim you as his own the moment you set foot on his property. So I urge you not to risk your newfound freedom by doing something so foolish. Instead, I suggest that you stay here, no longer as slaves, but as willing participants and part owners of this plantation. Yes, this is now your plantation." Mr. Jones bit his tongue to keep from objecting. "For now, we might as well leave Mr. Jones in charge," said Mr. Smith, "since he is the only one with any experience at running a plantation, which is quite a complicated thing to manage. But he will no longer be your master, but just another worker on the plantation. In fact, he will now be using his organizational and management skills to serve you. Whatever problems you may have had with him before, you are now all equals, and you need each other to make this work. If we all cooperate and work together, we can all reap the benefits together. In honor of this happy occasion, I present you this new symbol of togetherness and cooperation, this flag, which shall be the emblem of the new, free Jones plantation." He held up the new flag, but most of those listening were still too amazed to respond. "And this shall be our motto," Mr. Smith announced. "We work together as free men for our mutual benefit, pledging our allegiance to the Jones plantation, which stands for prosperity, liberty, and justice for all. To celebrate, everyone has the rest of the day off. Enjoy your freedom, do as you please, and be back here tomorrow morning, bright and early, so that we may begin work on this great and noble new endeavor as equal free men." Finally convinced that Mr. Smith was serious, the former slaves applauded and cheered.
Day 2.
"We all want this plantation to do well," Mr. Smith said at the beginning of the next meeting, "so we can all share in the benefits. We all know that it takes a lot of effort to make a cotton plantation work. Just because you're all free doesn't mean you can stop working. In fact, since you're now working for yourselves, I expect you to work even harder than ever before, but now with pride and joy, knowing that you're working for yourselves. Of course, there still have to be rules. If everyone just does whatever he wants, the plantation won't produce anything. This experiment will fail, and we'll all starve. You should be thankful that Mr. Jones has agreed to stay on to lend his knowledge and skills to this endeavor, and I trust you will all do your own part to make this work. Several of you have been chosen to act as project supervisors to manage different aspects of the operation, to make sure everyone is doing his assigned job, to make sure that the rules are followed, and so on. The rest of you may head out to the fields to start your first day of work as free men."
Day 3.
The next morning, Mr. Smith had a grim expression on his face as the daily meeting began. "I have an unpleasant duty to do today," he said. "Yesterday, Charles was caught keeping some of the cotton he picked, presumably to sell for his own personal profit. That is against the rules. That is stealing. For that, Charles must be punished." Two men tied Charles to the whipping post. I take no joy in this, Mr. Smith continued, but you must understand, if we do not maintain order, if we do not have rules that we all abide by, then the plantation will fail, and we will all suffer. The whip cracked against Charles' back. But if we all pitch in for the common good, then we can all prosper. Being free doesn't mean you should be selfish and greedy. We must each do our assigned duties and obey the rules, and then we can all benefit, and each of you will receive your appropriate share of the profits. A young man named Samuel stepped forward. But if you and Mr. Jones decide the rules and whip us if we disobey, how is that any different from what we had before? How can you say that? Mr. Smith asked. I'm shocked. You were a slave before, and now you're free. Things still need to be managed and organized by those best qualified to do so. Do you know how to run a plantation, Samuel? Well, no, he answered. But if we're free, why do we get no say in what the rules are and how things work? I'm surprised at your ingratitude, Mr. Smith answered. None of you know how a plantation is run, so you're in no position to be making decisions about how things are done here. You don't seem to appreciate all the things that Mr. Jones provides for you, from protecting you from all the outside threats that you know nothing about, those who would come here, capture and enslave you, if not for Mr. Jones' protection, to making sure that you all have food and housing, tools to work with, that you're cared for when sick and injured, and so on. There wouldn't be a plantation at all, no cotton to pick, no land to plant and harvest, if not for him. You should be grateful that he's made possible the level of comfort you now have. Your lives would be far worse if not for him. Nevertheless, as free and equal participants in this endeavor, from now on at each meeting, any worker may have 2 minutes to ask questions or voice suggestions or complaints. With that, the workers all seemed satisfied and headed out again to the fields to pick the cotton.
Day 4.
I have a big announcement, Mr. Smith said as the daily meeting began. Mr. Jones' cousin is here, and not just to visit and see how our project is coming along. It has been decided that from now on, you will be deciding who will manage the plantation. Of course, this job can't be done by just anyone, but every 3 months we will have a special meeting at which all the workers will vote on whether we think Mr. Jones should run the plantation or whether we think his cousin, Mr. Johnson, should run the plantation. That means that ultimately you are in charge because you will be deciding which man you want running things on your behalf. If you don't like the way things are being managed, you now have the power to change it. Amazed and pleased, the workers headed out again to the fields to pick the cotton. Days passed, months passed, a year passed, and the plantation continued to operate as before. Sometimes Mr. Jones was in charge, sometimes Mr. Johnson was in charge, but the day-to-day routine stayed exactly the same. The workers worked hard, long hours every day, and still had little to show for it. Every day the meeting would begin with them all reciting the Jones Plantation motto, "We work together as free men for our mutual benefit, pledging our allegiance to the Jones Plantation, which stands for prosperity, liberty, and justice for all." One day Mr. Smith announced, "Samuel is asked to say a few words this morning, and whatever the rest of us may think of his ideas and opinions, we are all free here, and that means we are all allowed to speak our minds. So, Samuel, you have 2 minutes. Begin." Samuel stepped forward, looking scared. "I was excited when all this started," he began, glancing nervously at Mr. Smith and Mr. Jones. "But don't you all see what's happened here? Nothing has changed. We're all still slaves." There were grumbles of disagreement from the crowd. "They tell us what to do and whip us if we don't. They still make all the rules and punish us if we disobey. They let us make suggestions and complain about things, but they never really change anything. They let us choose between Mr. Jones and Mr. Johnson, but what's the difference? The situation stays the same. We do all of the work and they take as much as they want and decide how much they'll let us keep. They live in luxury, made rich by the cotton we pick. We do all the work and have to build our own huts, grow our own food, and take care of ourselves. They leave us just enough that we don't revolt or run away. This is not freedom. We're all still slaves. They've only changed the words they use, but nothing else has changed. They say we're all free and equal, but we're not. They command and we obey. That's not freedom. That's not equality. They say we're free to leave, but all that means is that we're free to be someone else's slave. Why should we work or obey the rules? We didn't agree to this. They made the system. They forced it on us. They control and rob us and call it freedom. They've deceived you into thinking that being able to choose which slave master you'll work for is the same as being free. It's not. Open your eyes. If you keep what you produce, they call it stealing. When they take what you produce, they call it sharing and fair distribution. Can't you see that this is all? Your time is up, Samuel, Mr. Smith announced calmly. At his gesture, 2 supervisors grabbed Samuel by the arms and led him to the whipping post. I'm sorry, Samuel, but you've broken the rules. There are rules against encouraging others not to work and encouraging others to break the rules. You're only hurting all of us with your discontentment and your complaining and your disobedience. The whip fell and Samuel let out a grunt. Without rules, without order, all would be lost. Without law, there would be chaos. We can't just behave as wild animals, each doing whatever he pleases. We must all follow the plan and all do our duty for the betterment of everyone. And those who do not must be punished. The whip fell again and blood flowed freely from Samuel's back. Samuel, it is you who are stealing from the others. When you don't do your assigned work, you are making more work for others. When you disobey the rules, it is you who are endangering the future of everyone else here. You are the thief. You are the criminal. You are the one trying to destroy the arrangement that keeps us all safe and prosperous. At every lash of the whip, the other workers cheered louder and louder, some yelling curses at Samuel. Being spoiled and selfish, you complain about everything, talking as if you're oppressed. But you are the one ruining things. You are the one keeping us from being all we could be. It is your greed and your rebelliousness that is hurting all of us. They all play by the rules, Mr. Smith said, gesturing at the others. What makes you think that you don't have to? You think you're above the law? There were loud yells of agreement as the whip fell again. We must maintain order, Mr. Smith proclaimed, to make this plantation great, to make it so that we can all be happy and prosperous. To have the society we want, there have to be rules. We all have to contribute our fair share to this great endeavor, and we cannot tolerate actions and attitudes that seek to undermine the amazing things that together as free men we have achieved and will continue to achieve. Mr. Jones was smiling as he gave Mr. Smith a pat on the back. The crowd was cheering so loudly that none of them had noticed that Samuel had died.
What you have been taught about government and politics is no more accurate or reasonable than what Mr. Smith taught the slaves. If you're ready to look through the veil of rhetoric and propaganda to see the reality beneath, get a copy of The Most Dangerous Superstition. It will change the way you see the world.